In the vast landscape of Hollywood, where lights dazzle brighter than the stars above and dreams collide with harsh realities, the name Misty Upham is often whispered with both reverence and sorrow. She was not a typical Hollywood star. She was not born into privilege, nor did she ride into fame on the back of glamour. She was a fighter, a survivor, a voice for the unheard, and a presence that burned with authenticity. Yet, her journey would lead her into the deepest shadows, ending in mystery that still haunts the world she left behind. Misty was born on July 6, 1982, in Kalispell, Montana. The child of a Native American family, her roots were steeped in tradition, resilience, and a collective memory of a people who had seen their stories erased too many times. From the beginning, Misty carried those stories in her blood. And perhaps that was why, when she spoke, when she performed, her presence felt different. She wasn't reciting lines, she was channeling truth. Her eyes carried history. Her voice trembled with both pain and power, and audiences felt it deeply. Her childhood, however, was not one painted with golden warmth. Misty grew up with the weight of poverty and struggle pressing down on her family. The world around her was often harsh, and she battled with depression and anxiety from an early age. But within her was an unshakable determination. She found refuge in the arts, and especially in performance. Acting wasn't just a dream to Misty. It was survival. It was the only place where she could transform her pain into something meaningful, something undeniable. By her teenage years, Misty had already begun to stand apart. She was fearless in her ambition, even when circumstances told her she shouldn't be. Hollywood was not kind to Native actors. Roles were scarce, often stereotypical, reduced to caricatures that flattened real lives into cliches. But Misty refused to be confined. She wanted to tell stories of depth, of humanity, of raw honesty. She believed she could push her way into spaces that had long excluded women like her. Her family, particularly her father, was both her support and her anchor. Charles Upham would later become one of the loudest voices seeking answers after her death. A man who believed to his last breath that Misty deserved better, both in life and in the tragic aftermath that swallowed her. In the early 2000s, Misty began to find her footing. Independent films became her playground, the place where she could bypass the Hollywood system and connect with filmmakers who valued her raw, unfiltered presence. A breakout came with the 2008 film Frozen River, a harrowing story of poverty, survival, and illegal border crossings along the Mohawk Reservation. Misty's performance as Lila Little Wolf was unforgettable. She didn't just play the role, she lived it. Every line, every flicker in her expression was charged with authenticity. Critics praised her. Audiences wept with her. And for a brief moment, it seemed as if Hollywood had opened its arms. Misty received nominations and acclaim, and suddenly, a wider world of opportunity seemed within reach. But in Hollywood, the climb is treacherous. And for someone like Misty, a Native actress unwilling to compromise her authenticity, the path was even steeper. Despite her acclaim, roles remained limited. Hollywood had little imagination for where to place her. And instead of being celebrated, she found herself waiting for the phone to ring. The industry praised her talent but rarely offered her the stage she deserved. This professional struggle began to intertwine dangerously with her personal battles. Misty was open about her struggles with mental health. Depression stalked her relentlessly, and in the shadows of success, loneliness and instability began to grow. But Misty pressed on. In 2013, she landed a role in August, Osage County, alongside Hollywood giants like Meryl Streep and Julia Roberts. It was a career-defining moment, proof that she could stand on the grandest stage and hold her own. Those who watched her on set were stunned. Her ability to slip into character, To radiate truth even in small moments was extraordinary. Yet even as her star rose, Misty's life outside the screen remained complicated. Her family noticed changes. There were moments of elation and confidence, but also long periods of withdrawal, of silence, of pain she couldn't seem to shake. She moved often, sometimes without warning, chasing stability that always seemed to slip just out of reach. She sought help, leaned on those closest to her, but the systems designed to protect someone like Misty often failed. The healthcare world, much like Hollywood, rarely knew how to handle a Native woman carrying such a heavy storm inside her. By 2014, the cracks had widened. Misty was living in Washington State with her family, far from the spotlight. The bright lights of Hollywood seemed like a distant memory. She was only 32, still young, still full of potential, but the weight of her battles was pressing harder than ever. Her father noticed her pain deepening, her behavior becoming more erratic. She had been prescribed medication for anxiety, but even that seemed to bring more chaos than calm. The family worried constantly. Then came the night everything changed. It was October 5th, 2014, when Misty disappeared from her family's apartment in Auburn, Washington. She walked out without explanation, leaving behind the safety of her home and vanishing into the night. Her father immediately feared for her. Misty had been struggling deeply, and he pleaded with local authorities to take her disappearance seriously. But what followed was a pattern that would soon spark outrage. The police response was slow, dismissive, and reluctant. Charles Upham insisted his daughter was in danger, but he claimed officers brushed off his fears, suggesting Misty was simply another case of a troubled woman walking away. To them, it was not urgent. To her family, it was life or death. Days turned into weeks. Misty's face was plastered on flyers, her name whispered in fear across Native communities who knew all too well the epidemic of missing Indigenous women being ignored by the system. Search efforts mounted, but still no answers came. Until October 16th. That was the day. Misty's body was found at the bottom of a steep ravine, not far from her family's home. 11 days after she vanished, her story ended in the cold dirt of the Washington woods. The official word was that she died from blunt force injuries consistent with a fall. But to this day, questions remain. How did she end up there? Why did it take so long to find her? And why were the cries of her family ignored when they begged for help? The world lost Misty Upham at 32 years old. But the mystery of what truly happened to her, that was only beginning. The woods of Auburn, Washington, seemed almost too quiet that October day when Misty's body was discovered. Hidden in the ravine, she lay where no one should have been forgotten, where search parties had passed too many times without answers. The silence of the place was deafening, and to those who loved her, it carried the weight of something unspeakable. The official narrative was quick, almost too quick. The King County medical examiner ruled Misty's death accidental. They said she likely slipped, falling into the ravine and sustaining fatal injuries. It was a tidy explanation, a conclusion that could be neatly closed in a report. But to Misty's family, to her friends, to the Native community who had followed her disappearance with growing dread, nothing about it felt right. Charles Upham, her father, had been warning police from the moment she vanished. He told them his daughter was in crisis, that she wasn't safe, that she needed urgent help. But he later revealed that his pleas were met with indifference. He claimed officers dismissed his concerns, painting Misty as just another troubled woman, someone who would eventually turn up. To Charles, their inaction was not just negligence, it was betrayal. And when her body was finally found, his grief carried a sharp edge of anger. The days following the discovery were a storm of conflicting emotions. For the Upham family, the pain was unbearable. Misty had been their fighter, their dreamer, the one who carried so much love and yet bore so much pain. Losing her was like losing the sun. But alongside the grief was outrage, a gnawing conviction that her death had been preventable, that the system had failed her again and again. Misty's sister Amanda spoke out, her voice trembling with both sorrow and fire. She demanded answers, demanded to know why search efforts hadn't been taken seriously, why her family's warnings had been brushed aside. She reminded the world that Misty was not just another statistic, not just another Native woman lost to silence. She was an artist, a daughter, a sister, a human being who deserved more. And yet, the wider world seemed almost muted in its response. Hollywood, the very place that had once applauded her talent, offered only faint whispers. A few tributes surfaced, colleagues remembering her as kind, authentic, fiercely talented. But there was no uproar, no collective outrage from an industry that so often rushes to claim tragedy when it suits its image. Misty had stood on the same stage as Meryl Streep, yet in death. Her name faded quickly from the headlines. Her family would not let it rest. Charles Upham spoke publicly, sharing his belief that the police had failed Misty, that systemic racism and neglect had played a role in her death. He reminded anyone who would listen that Native women go missing and are murdered at alarming rates. Yet their cases are so often ignored, dismissed, or left unresolved. Misty's story, he said, was not just hers alone. It was part of a haunting pattern that, as weeks turned into months, the questions only deepened. Some whispered that Misty may have been fleeing from danger the night she disappeared. Others believed she was in the grip of a mental health crisis, wandering without direction. But then, there were darker theories, ones that suggested foul play, that someone had chased her, that she had been silenced. None of these questions ever found solid answers. The official stance never shifted. Accidental death. Nothing more. Case closed. But for those who knew Misty, closure never came. Her death had left too many gaps, too many cracks in the story. And those cracks began to widen as more voices joined her family's call for truth. Native activists, filmmakers, and advocates spoke Misty's name, tying her story to the wider crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women across North America. They argued that Misty's tragedy was not isolated. It was part of a broken system, one that allowed countless women to disappear without justice. Misty's life became a symbol, her death a rallying cry. Yet beneath the activism and the headlines, there was still the unbearable personal grief. Her mother, her siblings, her friends, they lived with the quiet devastation of her absence. They spoke of her laughter, her quirks, the way she could light up a room even on her darkest days. Those who worked with her remembered the fire in her eyes, the intensity she brought to every role. And every memory seemed to echo the same unshakable truth. She should still be here. Her story, though brief, left a scar on Hollywood, on her community, on her family. But it also left an unanswered question, one that still hangs in the air like smoke. What really happened to Misty Upham in those final days? As the years passed, rumors continued to swirl, each one painting a different picture of her last moments. Was she running from fear? Was she searching for peace? Or was there someone or something waiting in the shadows that night? The truth, it seems, remains buried in that ravine. And with every passing year, Misty's name becomes a haunting reminder that justice is not always served, that stories are not always finished, and that sometimes the brightest lights are extinguished long before the world is ready. The official report insisted it was simple. A tragic fall. An accident. Nothing more. Yet the deeper one looks into the final days of Misty Upham, the more the simplicity dissolves into shadows. October 5th, 2014, the day Misty walked away. Family members later recalled that she had been deeply distressed, struggling to control her anxiety. There were moments when she seemed frightened, moments when she seemed confused. Her father would later reveal she had stopped taking her medication days before, because it made her feel worse. The withdrawal left her vulnerable, unsteady. Yet even through the storm, Misty clung to the fragile thread of survival. That night, neighbors reported strange noises, movement near the apartment complex, figures shifting in the dark. Some said they saw Misty wandering near traffic. Others claimed she might have been followed. But none of these reports were ever fully investigated. They became whispers unconfirmed, unresolved, left to vanish in the silence of police reports that never made it to the public. What is known is this: Misty left without her wallet, without her phone, without anything that might have helped her if she intended to run away. She disappeared into the Washington night, and no one saw her alive again. Her father believed, to his last breath, that Misty was running from something that night. He spoke of her fear, how she had told him once that she felt unsafe, that there were people who wanted to hurt her. He insisted she would not have wandered into the woods alone. But these warnings, like so many of his pleas, were swallowed in silence. When her body was found 11 days later, the scene raised more questions than answers. The ravine where she lay was steep, overgrown, and difficult to access. Search parties had scoured the area earlier, yet somehow missed her. Had she truly fallen there on the night she disappeared, or had her body been moved later? There were no clear answers, and the lack of a thorough investigation left a hole where truth should have been. Witnesses began to come forward with strange accounts. Some said they heard screams the night Misty vanished. Others spoke of suspicious figures in the woods. And yet, each report seemed to dissolve into thin air, dismissed or ignored by the authorities. For Misty's family, it was unbearable. To them, the system had abandoned her twice, first in life, then in death. As the questions mounted, so did the theories. Some believe Misty's death was a tragic accident, the result of mental health struggles that led her into dangerous terrain. Others were convinced foul play was involved, that someone had chased her into the night, forcing her into the ravine where her life was cut short. And then there were those who looked at the wider picture, at the thousands of Indigenous women who had gone missing or been murdered, their cases overlooked by law enforcement, and saw Misty's death not as an isolated tragedy, but as part of a haunting pattern. The silence from Hollywood only deepened the sting. Few of her colleagues spoke publicly about her passing. The industry that had once celebrated her authenticity now turned its gaze elsewhere, as if Misty's story was too uncomfortable, too tangled to keep in the spotlight. But among those who remembered her, her death became a symbol, a reminder of how even the brightest talent could be left behind, erased by indifference. Her journals, later revealed by family, painted a heartbreaking portrait. Misty wrote of her struggles with identity, her battles with depression, her desperate yearning to be understood. She wrote of the pain of being native in a world that rarely saw her people, and of her dream to give voice to those who had been silenced. Her words were raw, unfiltered, and prophetic, a window into a storm that few had ever truly seen. And yet, in those pages, there was also hope. Dreams of future roles, of stories she wanted to tell, of the daughter she hoped to inspire someday. Misty believed in the power of art to heal. She believed her voice mattered. That belief carried her through so much darkness and made the way her story ended all the more devastating. The ravine remains quiet now. The earth has long since reclaimed the space where Misty's body was found. But the questions, the rumors, the unhealed wounds remain. Her family still believes justice was never served. Her community still speaks her name with reverence and pain. And her story lingers, unresolved, like a film left without its final scene. Because in the end, the truth of what happened to Misty Upham that October night may never be known. But the silence around her death speaks volumes. And in that silence lies the real mystery. Misty's death did not just mark the end of one woman's journey. It became a haunting reflection of something much larger, something systemic, something that has silenced generations of voices. When the news broke, Indigenous communities across North America were struck with grief, but not surprise. They had seen this story before, repeated in countless names, countless faces, countless families left searching. Misty's tragedy was not an isolated misfortune. It was part of the dark tapestry of missing and murdered Indigenous women, a crisis long ignored by the very institutions meant to protect them. Activists began to speak her name at rallies, holding her photograph high, reminding the world that Misty was not just an actress, not just a headline, but a daughter, a sister, a storyteller. Her story became a rallying cry, a demand for change, for visibility, for justice, not just for her, but for the thousands of others whose stories never made it to the front page. Her father, Charles Upham, refused to let her memory fade into silence. He became her voice, speaking to journalists, urging the world to look closer, to see the injustice. He spoke of her struggles, her fears, her final days not to exploit her pain, but to shine light on a system that had failed her. He insisted Misty's case was not handled with care, that vital time was lost, that the response was slow because she was Native, because her life was not given the weight it deserved. And his words struck a painful chord. Across the United States and Canada, families nodded in sorrow because they too had lived as truth. Women vanishing without urgency, cases dismissed as runaways or accidents, and justice slipping through their fingers like smoke. Misty's death became more than a personal tragedy. It became evidence of a national wound. Meanwhile, in Hollywood, the silence was deafening. A few colleagues remembered her brilliance, her raw emotion on screen. Meryl Streep, who had worked with Misty on August, Osage County, called her a gifted actress. Others offered quiet tributes. But for the most part, the industry moved on, leaving Misty's legacy in the shadows. For her family, it was another abandonment proof that even in death, she was unseen by the world she had fought so hard to enter. Yet her performances refused to fade. Viewers returned to her roles as the grief-stricken housekeeper in August, Osage County, the struggling mother in Frozen River, the fierce spirit who carried so much unspoken pain. On screen, Misty was alive, burning with truth, a mirror to her own struggles. In those roles, she immortalized the very resilience her life embodied. Her death raised unsettling questions. Why did the police dismiss her family's pleas? Why were reports of screams and suspicious activity never followed up? Why did it take 11 days for her body to be found in a place that had supposedly already been searched? Each question chipped away at the official story of accident. Each unanswered detail deepened the shadows around her death, and so Misty became both a symbol and a mystery. A symbol of how Indigenous women are too often erased, their lives cut short without justice. And a mystery because the truth of what really happened that night in October 2014 remains tangled, elusive, hidden in silence, even now, years later. Her name is spoken with reverence at vigils, her face appears on banners, and her story is retold not just as a cautionary tale, but as a call to action. Misty's death was not just the loss of a rising star. It was the reminder of how many voices are silenced, how many stories remain unfinished. Her legacy lingers not in the headlines, not in Hollywood tributes, but in the determination of those who refuse to let her vanish into the forgotten corners of history. Misty Upham was more than the mystery of her death. She was a woman who carried truth on her shoulders, who left behind words, performances, and a cry for justice that still echoes today, because in the end, her story is not just about how she died. It is about why she mattered. The story of Misty Upham does not end with her body being found in the shadows of a ravine. If anything, that is where it truly begins, where her mystery deepens, where her legacy takes on its most haunting shape. Because even in death, Misty seemed to be telling us something. Her disappearance, her family's desperate pleas, the slow and dismissive response, and the eventual discovery of her body. It all felt like a reflection of the very themes she had embodied in her films. A woman caught between worlds, unseen by the systems around her, crying out in silence until it was too late. Her final days, pieced together from fragments, spoke of fear, of feeling hunted, of knowing that danger was near. Witnesses said she had run from her home in Auburn, panicked, disoriented. Neighbors claimed to have heard screams in the night. Police brushed these off. And when she was finally found 11 days later, the explanation was offered swiftly, almost too neatly: an accident. A fall. No foul play suspected. But the people who loved her most, and the community that mourned her, could not accept that. Too much was left unexplained. Too many questions were left hanging in the air like smoke. If it was an accident, why had she been so afraid? If it was an accident, why were her cries ignored? If it was an accident, why did it take so long for help to come? The truth was swallowed by silence. And perhaps that is the cruelest part of her story. Not just the tragedy of her passing, but the absence of answers. The erasure of justice. Yet Misty's legacy is not erased. It lingers in the ache of her performances, in the voices of activists who invoke her name, in the families of Indigenous women who see her story as their own. She has become part of a much larger narrative, one that demands attention, one that refuses to be forgotten. Hollywood may have moved on, but Misty lives on in the quiet defiance of memory, in the frozen rivers of her films, in the fiery storms of her truth, in the lingering question mark of her death. And so, when we think of Misty Upham, we are not just remembering an actress. We are remembering a woman who walked through the shadows of both art and life, who carried the weight of pain and beauty in equal measure, and who left behind a mystery that still unsettles the night. Her story ends not with certainty, but with a haunting echo. An echo that asks us to listen closer, to see clearer, to never let silence bury truth. Because Misty Upham was more than what happened to her. She was a voice. She was a warning. She was a mystery that refuses to vanish. In the weeks after Misty's body was found, the official narrative settled like a heavy fog. No foul play, accidental fall, case closed. But silence is not always peace. Sometimes, silence is louder than words. For Misty's family, silence meant abandonment. They had begged authorities to take her disappearance seriously. They had raised alarms, organized searches, and prayed for urgency. Instead, they were met with hesitation, dismissal, and delays that cost precious time. By the time she was found, hope had already slipped away. This silence felt deliberate, as though Misty's life did not weigh the same as others. Her father said it plainly. If she wasn't native, they would have looked sooner. His voice cracked, but his words struck like lightning. It wasn't just grief speaking. It was true. And yet, Misty's story carried contradictions that made it even more haunting. Friends described her as radiant, filled with laughter, full of dreams about new roles, about writing, about finally stepping into the recognition she deserved. But her journals, fragments of her private words, revealed shadows of anxiety, paranoia, and fear of being followed. What was real? What was imagined? Was someone truly out there, waiting in the night? Or was it the crushing weight of untreated pain? The mystery lies not just in how Misty died, but in the duality of her final days: light and dark, hope and despair, life and death circling one another like dancers in the dark. Activists continued to march with her name, while her family battled waves of grief that never seemed to end. They knew Misty's spirit was larger than the headlines, larger than the shallow explanations offered. Her death had become a mirror, reflecting the broken systems that ignored so many before her. But in the quiet moments, away from cameras and protests, her family remembered the woman they knew. Misty, the girl who loved to sing, who laughed at inside jokes, who dreamed of lifting her people with her art. Misty, who was always aware of the shadows around her, yet carried a light too bright to be contained. That light, even in death, refused to go out. It shines in every conversation about missing Indigenous women. It glows in every rewatch of her films. It burns in the unanswered questions that keep her story alive. And perhaps that is the strangest part of Misty's mystery, the way her silence became its own form of resistance, its own haunting voice. Because sometimes what is left unsaid speaks louder than anything else. Misty Upham may be gone, but her silence continues to echo. And in that echo, there is a challenge to listen, to remember, to refuse to let the forgotten stay forgotten.